July 1944. The Normandy Bocage, south of Saint-Lô. Inside the steel hull of a German Panzer IV, the air is heavy, and the heavy grey clouds above. The crew is relaxed. They have survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. Each battery required entirely different compass, azimuths, and barrel elevations to hit the exact same patch of mud. Within seconds, the clerks translated the map grid into precise firing data for each separate battery. The field telephones rang in the gun pits. The gun crews standing in the rain did not know they were aiming at a German tank. They did not need to see the target or understand the tactical situation. They simply heard a voice over the wire, rattling off numbers for deflection, elevation, and powder charge. Sweating loaders shoved high explosive rounds into the breeches. Gunners turned steel handwheels, locking the heavy barrels into place based purely on the math sent from the FDC. The switchboard had successfully centralized the firepower of an entire battalion, routing the firing data for 12 heavy cannons to point at a single, invisible target. The speed of the FDC explains how the American military processed the observer's request before the German tank crew even turned off their Maybach engine. But moving information quickly across a battlefield still leaves a physical problem unsolved. If the FDC simply ordered all 12 guns to fire, the moment they were loaded, the shells would not land at the same time. Because Battery C was twice as far away as Battery A, its shells would take much longer to fly through the air. The German crew in the depression would hear the first impacts from the closest guns. By understanding the rigid rules of artillery survival, they know that artillery is a blind weapon, recognize the danger, and use their guaranteed 2 minutes to escape before the rest of the barrage arrived. Information moving quickly still does not explain the complete absence of ranging shots. To trap the tank, the math had to manipulate not just space, but time. The terror of the American artillery barrage was not in the weight of the steel, but in the precision of the clock. This was the mechanism of time on target, or TOT. It was a mathematical discipline that treated a battalion of 12 cannons as a single, coordinated musical instrument, where every shell, regardless of how far it had to travel, had to land at the exact same millisecond. The German panzer crew in the depression was waiting for the familiar, broken rhythm of a traditional barrage, a lone spotting round, followed by the sluggish, piecemeal arrival of individual shells. They expected a tempo they could outrun. The FDC, however, had calculated a tempo that made escape physically impossible. Each shell had a known flight time based on its powder charge and the distance it had to cover. The clerks in the FDC tent performed a simple subtraction. If the guns of Battery A needed 30 seconds for their shells to reach the target, but the guns of Battery C, positioned much further away, needed 60 seconds, the FDC did not order them to fire at once. To kill a tank, an enemy battery must first have a forward observer who can physically see the target. They ordered Battery C to open fire 30 seconds earlier than Battery A. This created a phantom countdown. The gunners in the pits did not fire on command from an observer. They fired on a precise, synchronized schedule provided by the FDC. The heavy shells arched through the clouds from different directions, climbing toward different altitudes and tracing different ballistic paths across the sky. They were miles apart in the air, yet they were locked in an invisible, synchronized formation. When the German commander listened for the ranging shot, he heard nothing because the FDC had skipped that phase entirely. The grid was already registered. The math was already verified. The only thing left was the silent, inevitable convergence of 12 different trajectories. The result was a vertical wall of high explosive impact. For the German crew, there was no transition between safety and destruction. One moment, they were sitting in a quiet, concealed depression. The next, the ground beneath them simply vanished into a singular, crushing explosion. Because the shells arrived simultaneously, the concussion did not push the tank in one direction. It compressed it from all sides at once. It was not a series of hits, but a sudden, total displacement of the atmosphere. This mathematical synchronization meant that the American military could effectively bracket a target before firing a single shell. If the observer suspects a tank is hiding behind a hill, he must call for a ranging shot. By knowing the grid, the FDC ensured that the first round to land was not a wasted warning shot, but the full weight delivery of the entire battalion. The German crew's tactical maneuver, the shoot and scoot, relied on the assumption that the enemy would require time to react. The TOT system turned that assumption into a death sentence because it removed the lag between detection and total impact. But this level of coordination requires more than just clocks and maps. It requires a nervous system. The FDC could calculate the math in seconds, but that math had to be delivered to dozens of scattered, muddy gun pits under the chaos of constant shelling, retreating friendly lines, and broken communication. The system only worked if the American grid was physically held together by an unprecedented density of radio hardware. If the FDC was the brain, the radio network was the spine. A mathematical formula drawn on a map inside a quiet tent is useless if it cannot survive the physical friction of a battlefield. In Normandy, the ground was a churning nightmare of mud, shattered trees, and constant mortar fire. The traditional method of transmitting artillery coordinates was field telephone wire. But wire was fragile. It was shredded by shrapnel, crushed by tank tracks. A lone shell will land 50 yards long. A second will land 50 yards short. This process of bracketing takes time, and severed by retreating infantry. When the German army laid wire, a single stray shell could cut off a frontline unit from its artillery support. Mending that break required a lineman to crawl through the mud, find the severed ends, and splice them together under fire. The German command structure relied heavily on this vulnerable copper thread. When the wire broke, the system collapsed, leaving local commanders blind and isolated. The American military bypassed the mud entirely. They saturated the European theater with an unprecedented density of frequency modulation hardware. The backbone of this invisible network was the SCR-300, a heavy, battery-powered radio carried on the back of an infantryman. To the German soldiers, it was just another piece of equipment. To the American war machine, it was the physical lifeline that held the entire artillery grid together. The American radio network did not rely on a single, fragile strand of copper. It was an overlapping, redundant web of FM signals. The frequency modulation technology cut through the static of battle, allowing clear voice transmission over several miles. Every infantry company commander had one. Every Sherman tank carried a powerful SCR-508 radio. Above the battlefield, fragile, unarmed Piper Cub aircraft circled at 3,000 feet, their pilots looking down at the hedgerows. It requires a radio or telephone conversation between the observer and the guns. It always gives a veteran crew, with direct radio links to the fire direction centers. This industrial abundance of radios fundamentally democratized the American artillery. In the German army, calling for heavy fire was a privilege reserved for specialized forward observers and high-ranking officers. In the American army, the grid was accessible to almost anyone with a handset. If an infantry lieutenant saw a Panzer IV backing into a depression, he did not need to find an artillery officer. He simply keyed his handset, read the pre-registered concentration number off his map, and pushed his voice directly into the FDC switchboard. If a radio operator was killed, Another picked up the microphone. If a battalion FDC was forced to relocate, the observer simply switched frequencies and routed his fire mission to a neighboring FDC. The network was fluid. It could not be severed by a single artillery shell or a cut wire. It draped an invisible ceiling over the battlefield, connecting the eyes on the front line to the cannons in the rear at the speed of light. The German tank crew south of Saint-Lô never saw the radio that trapped them. They only felt the consequence of a communication system that functioned perfectly under pressure. The mathematical precision of time on target was only possible because the FM radios and the FDC worked together between 2 and 4 minutes to start their engine and relocate before the lethal volley arrives, turning scattered infantry reports into centralized violence. But eliminating a single, retreating Panzer IV was a localized tactical event. The system had proven it could trap one vehicle hiding in a blind depression. The true test of the American grid was not whether it could kill a spite, stationary target. The question was whether this invisible architecture could hold together when the German military abandoned the defensive, massed their armor, and launched a full-scale divisional counterattack. August 1944. The Mortain counteroffensive. The German High Command attempts to turn the war back to their terms: massed armor, aggressive concentration of force, and rapid maneuver. Under the cover of darkness, multiple panzer divisions gather to drive a steel wedge toward the sea, aiming to split the Allied armies. According to their established doctrine, speed and armored shock will overwhelm local defenses, leaving the sluggish enemy artillery firing at empty crossroads long after the tanks have passed. But as the morning fog lifts, the advancing German columns are not driving into a traditional defense. They are driving directly into the fully awakened American grid. High above the armored spearheads, fragile L4 Grasshopper liaison planes circle like slow insects. Down in the valleys, infantrymen armed with SCR 300 radios watch the roads. The panzer divisions are not maneuvering through open territory. They are moving across a giant, pre-calculated switchboard. When the lead German elements reach a bottleneck, a stone bridge, a narrow village street, or a steep valley pass, the radio network activates. The crew listens. They wait for the lone, whistling crack of the ranging shot. It never comes. The observers do not panic or manually calculate distances. They simply read the grid coordinates. Miles away, the fire direction centers receive dozens of calls simultaneously. The switchboards light up, and the FDC officers realize they are not hunting a single vehicle. They are looking at an entire armored division trapped on the map. The FDC escalates the math. They do not just assign a single artillery battalion, they link multiple divisional and corps-level artillery groups. A time-on-target mission against a massed panzer formation might involve 6, 8, or even 12 battalions firing at once. The result is a mechanical and human slaughter. When a German armored column attempts to assemble in a protective forest, the trees violently detonate. The American artillery utilizes variable time fuses, causing the heavy, high-explosive shells to burst in the air just above the canopy. The explosions shower the vehicles with lethal fragmentation, while the thick, sloped armor of a Panther or a Panzer IV might survive the shrapnel. Armored divisions do not move alone. They rely on a highly vulnerable tail of fuel trucks, unarmored half-tracks, supply wagons, and marching infantry. The American grid annihilates this soft underbelly. When a column is hit simultaneously by a massive TOT barrage, the road instantly becomes impassable. Burning fuel trucks block the retreat. Shattered trees and craters block the advance. The surviving panzers are trapped in the center, their mobility entirely stripped away. Instead, the air above the depression instantly tears open. There is no warning. There is no bracketing. The German commanders try to adapt using their Eastern Front instincts. They order their tanks to disperse, to break visual contact, and to seek the safety of reverse slopes and deep ravines. But they are moving inside a cage. Every logical fallback position is already registered. The moment the German armor attempts to hide in a depression, an observer simply radios the new concentration number. The FDC routes the geometry, and the invisible ceiling drops again, crushing the very terrain the Germans believed would save them. At Mortain, the American artillery network achieved something unprecedented. It did not just disable tanks, it froze the doctrine of maneuver warfare. The panzer divisions found they could not concentrate for an attack because massing vehicles drew immediate, synchronized destruction. They could not retreat because the roads behind them were pre-calculated kill zones. The invisible system had scaled perfectly, transforming local ambushes into operational paralysis. But what was the final cost of this invisible ceiling for the men trapped underneath it, and the Clarks projecting it from miles away? South of Saint-Lô, the ringing in the ears of the surviving German tank crew finally begins to fade. They pull themselves from the shattered steel hatch of their Panzer IV, coughing through the thick, settling dust of the depression. Without a single adjustment round, 30 high-explosive shells detonate directly on top of the Panzer IV in the exact same fraction of a second. They look around the freshly cratered earth, trying to understand how their flawless retreat ended in immediate annihilation. They search the nearby tree line for the forward observer they assume must be hiding there. They listen for the heavy engine of an enemy tank that somehow flanked their position. They find nothing but shredded leaves, overturned dirt, and the sharp smell of burnt explosive. They are looking for a physical enemy in their immediate line of sight, because their years on the Eastern Front taught them that combat was a localized duel. But the true nature of the trap they fell into was entirely unseen. The question in the hedgerows was never really about the thickness of German armor, the speed of a Maybach engine, or the tactical advantage of a reverse slope defense. It was about an invisible architecture built on grid paper, frequency modulation, and the mathematical manipulation of time. The German crew believed they had outmaneuvered the Americans by simply breaking visual contact. They did not realize that the United States military had already weaponized the blind spots. The American artillery did not need to see the tank to kill it. It only needed the tank to behave logically and occupy a numbered coordinate. The Panzer was not destroyed by a superior gunner looking through a telescopic sight, with the smell of burnt cordite and the sharp tang of hot grease. The Maybach engine idles, vibrating through the floor plates. The concussive wave caves in the engine deck, shatters the suspension, and permanently disables the vehicle. It was erased by a system that turned the map itself into a lethal, activated weapon. Yet, that system was not an abstract, automatic machine. It was not magic. It was a massive, fragile chain of human labor, held together by men trying to function under the extreme friction of a brutal campaign. The time-on-target barrage that crushed the Panzer was initiated by an exhausted infantryman kneeling in a flooded ditch, clutching the heavy plastic handset of his radio. It was verified by a Piper Cub pilot circling in an unarmed canvas plane, watching the terrain while desperately evading ground fire. Above all, the system was driven by the Clarks in the Fire Direction Center. They sat in damp, dimly lit tents miles behind the line, sweating over plotting boards, steel pins, and graphical scales. They translated map squares into precise barrel elevations and compass azimuths, solving lethal geometry problems in seconds while field telephones continually rang for support. And at the physical end of the chain were the gun crews. They stood ankle-deep in the mud of the rear echelon, their hearing permanently dulled by the constant concussive blast of the howitzers. They hauled heavy brass casings and 90-pound shells violently loading the breeches. The surviving crew members bail out into a cratered wasteland, disoriented and deafened. They are looking at an impossible battlefield result, hour after hour. They never saw the panzers they killed. They never saw the depression south of Saint-Lô. They only saw the mathematical numbers shouted over the wire. The German tank crew staggering away from their ruined vehicle was not defeated by the infantry they had engaged. They had followed the old rules perfectly, only to be crushed on a pre-calculated point on a map. They were systematically dismantled by a barrage ordered by a man they never saw, calculated by a clerk in a canvas tent, and fired by an artilleryman looking at nothing but the mud beneath his boots. No American observer could see them. No ranging shot was fired to correct the aim. Yet the artillery did not just hit near them. It landed with the concentrated weight of an entire battalion, perfectly centered on a patch of empty mud hidden behind a hill. The synchronization was so tight that the shells, fired from cannons miles apart, arrived as a single physical wall of fragmentation. In the logic of traditional warfare, this was a mathematical impossibility. Artillery was supposed to behave like a clumsy giant, feeling its way blindly toward its target by throwing rocks and waiting to hear where they fell. This strike did not feel its way. It arrived with the precision of a sniper. The German crew had executed a flawless tactical maneuver. They fired, they moved, and they broke visual contact. They did exactly what they were trained to do. To understand why a perfectly executed retreat resulted in immediate destruction, we first need to examine the doctrine. At a distance of 800 meters, an American Sherman tank is burning, the result of a single, precise, armor-piercing round that built their confidence, and why breaking the line of sight had always been enough to keep them alive. For the German tank crews fighting in France in the summer of 1944, their combat instincts were not born in the hedgerows. They were forged on the vast, open steppes of the Soviet Union. In that brutal theater, survival depended entirely on mastering the geometry of visibility. A stationary tank was a dead tank. The standard operating procedure was simple and strictly enforced. Find a hull-down firing position, engage the enemy armor, and immediately reverse into hard cover before the enemy artillery could respond. It was a deadly, calculated game, governed by rigid and predictable mechanical rules. The fundamental rule was that artillery was a slow, blunt instrument. A heavy howitzer positioned 5 or 10 miles behind the front lines could not see what it was shooting at. It relied entirely on the eyes of a forward observer equipped with field glasses and a field telephone or a heavy backpack radio. When a panzer revealed itself by firing, the observer had to spot the muzzle flash, manually estimate the distance, cross-reference his paper map, and relay those approximate coordinates back to the gun battery. This human communication chain created a built-in, unavoidable delay from the German 75mm gun. The German commander does not wait to admire the kill. He taps the driver's shoulder. Even when the battery received the coordinates, the guns did not simply unleash their full destructive weight. Artillery ammunition was heavy, logistically expensive, and difficult to transport. A battery commander could not afford to waste shells on a mathematical guess. Instead, the battery fired a single spotting round. The forward observer watched the plume of smoke rise, calculated the error, and called back a manual correction. He would demand a drop of 50 meters or a shift left of 100. Then came the second spotting round. Only when the target was successfully bracketed between a long and a short impact would the battery commander finally issue the order to fire for effect. This mechanical loop gave the German tank crew their most valuable resource: time. From the moment the first whistling ranging shell threw dirt into the air, a veteran panzer crew knew they had a guaranteed window of 2 to 4 minutes. That was all the time it took for the driver to heave back on the steering levers, engage the transmission, and crawl the 30-ton machine backward behind a ridgeline. The moment the tank broke the observer's line of sight, the enemy's targeting loop was severed. The artillery would blindly pound the empty patch of dirt where the tank used to be. The German crew would sit safely in a new, concealed secondary position, listening to the harmless explosions, ready to hunt again. The Panzer IV grinds into reverse, its tracks tearing through the damp earth, and backs away from the firing line. This was the exact logic the Panzer commander applied in the damp fields south of Saint-Lô. When he backed his vehicle into that reverse slope depression, he was executing a textbook survival tactic. The heavy, ancient earth banks and sunken lanes of Normandy provided far better physical concealment than the Russian plains. By slipping behind the ridge, he had successfully blinded the American infantry and any observer traveling with them. Without direct eyes on the target, the American guns should have been forced to restart the tedious process of bracketing a new, unknown location. The crew was safe. The math was on their side. The German calculation made perfect tactical sense. The crew followed the old rules flawlessly. They were not defeated by a failure of their own training or by a lucky, random shot. They were defeated because the rules governing the weapon, firing at them, no longer existed. If the terrain hid them perfectly and the traditional targeting loop had been broken, how did the Americans know exactly where the tank was hiding? To find the answer, we have to look away from the mud of the front line and examine the mathematical architecture the Americans had draped over the battlefield before the tanks ever arrived. Hours before the German Panzer fired its first shot, an American artillery officer stood inside a damp canvas tent several miles behind the front line. The crew follows a strict, proven rhythm. They retreat 150 meters, slipping behind a low ridge. On a folding wooden table, he studied a standard-issue topographical map. The paper was overlaid with a tight, rigid lattice of intersecting lines. This was the American artillery grid. The German tank crew experienced the Normandy bocage as a physical, immediate environment. They saw thick roots, stone walls, blind corners, and earth. But the American artillery apparatus did not look at mud or trees. It looked at pure geometry. The United States military had fundamentally shifted how it understood the battlefield. They were no longer hunting individual tanks. They were weaponizing the map itself. Long before the American infantry began their advance, artillery planners and intelligence officers scrutinized the topographical contours of the sector. They did not wait for the enemy to reveal themselves. Instead, they asked a practical question. If a competent German tank commander needed to retreat from the main road, where would the terrain naturally force him to go? They systematically identified every tactical choke point. They marked the crossroads, the dense tree lines, the sunken lanes, and the reverse slope depressions. Every one of these logical hiding spots was assigned a specific, pre-registered number, known in American doctrine as a target concentration. Across a single divisional front, there might be hundreds of these invisible, numbered targets, silently waiting on the paper and dropping into a natural depression in the terrain. The engine is throttled down. They are now in full defilade. For each concentration, the artillery batteries situated miles away had already done the heavy mathematical lifting. They had pre-calculated the exact azimuth, the required elevation of the gun barrel, the specific powder charge, and the flight time of the shell. They did not need to physically see the depression to hit it. They already owned the formula required to reach it. When the Panzer commander threw his vehicle into reverse and backed down the hill south of Saint-Lô, he believed he was slipping into an anonymous, safe patch of blind terrain. In reality, he was parking his 30-ton machine directly on top of a pre-calculated coordinate. The American forward observer advancing behind the burning Sherman did not need an active line of sight. He watched the Panzer disappear behind the ridge. He unfolded his own copy of the grid map. He recognized the shape of the terrain, looked at the numbered squares, and identified the only logical depression the German tank could use to hide. Under the old rules, the observer would have to estimate the distance, call for a spotting round, and begin the slow process of bracketing. But under the grid system, he did not need to describe the tank or ask for a ranging shot. The burning Sherman and the American infantry advancing behind it can no longer see them. A wall of earth and thick hedgerow stands. He only needed to pick up his radio handset and transmit a single pre-registered concentration number back to the rear. The grid explains how the American military knew where the tank was without actually seeing it. It explains why the traditional requirement for a visual spotting round was bypassed. But knowing a map coordinate is only half the equation. A single infantryman speaking a number into a radio does not explain how 30 high-explosive shells, fired by heavy cannons positioned in entirely different locations, arrived on that exact coordinate in the exact same fraction of a second. To understand that synchronized violence, we have to look away from the map and examine the hidden switchboard that received the observer's call. In the American military structure of 1944, the forward observer looking at the ridge did not own the cannons he was calling. In the German army, an observer was usually tethered to his specific battery of 4 guns. If he encountered a target too large for his own unit, requesting additional fire support meant passing a request up a slow, bureaucratic chain of command. By the time permission was granted and coordinates were relayed to other batteries, the target had often moved between the Panzer and the enemy. The German commander looks through his cupola periscope. He sees only the slope of the hill. The United States Army eliminated this bottleneck by inventing the Fire Direction Center, or FDC, located safely out of enemy sight, usually in a heavily camouflaged tent filled with folding tables, battery-powered radios, and field telephones. The FDC was the brain of the artillery network. The men inside did not load shells or pull lanyards. They were clerks, mathematicians, and wiremen. When the American observer radioed the pre-registered concentration number where the Panzer was hiding, his voice echoed in one of these tents. He was not speaking to a cannon. He was speaking to a switchboard. Instantly, the FDC transformed the tactical request into a mathematical factory line. The officer in charge evaluated the target and decided a single battery of 4 guns was not enough to guarantee the destruction of a heavily armored Panzer IV. He authorized a battalion-level mission. This is where the invisible machinery operated at a speed the German military could not replicate. The FDC clerks used plotting boards, steel pins, and graphical firing scales. Because they already knew the coordinates of the target depression, and they knew the exact surveyed locations of their own gun batteries, they quickly generated the specific geometry required for each unit. Battery A was located 2 miles south of the target. Battery B was positioned 3 miles southeast. Battery C was dug into an orchard 4 miles away.